"What do you prefer for a mix, sir?" he asked, disdainfully wrinkling his nose. He was sure it was not arbutus he was smelling. Danny stared at him. "What do you want for a wash?" the bartender repeated, wearily sinking to the argot of the proletariat. "Gin," Danny shot back, whereupon the cocktail-hour stragglers giggled and roared and carelessly flung down their dry martinis. Spring was in the air. At midnight old Danny betook himself and his pack-sack outside for a little fresh air, and, oh yes, to meet his Chicago fisherman. In the meantime he had achieved that state of gentle glow sometimes known as drunk to advanced students of semantics. But Danny did not get to meet the train. The unmet Chicago fishermen arrived at the hotel just in time to discover their official guide all tangled up in the hotel's new terraced rock garden, from which the wiry little Cornish gardener was vainly trying to dislodge him. "'Ere, damme, man, you're a trampin' all over my crocus and tulip beds, you are. Come out o' there," Cookie the gardener shrilled. "Is that so, me lad? And me preferrin' peonies. Where's the bloody peonies?" Danny answered, charging like a bewildered gnu through a trellis designed for sweet peas. Thence over the steep edge of the rock garden, thence to the sidewalk below, where he and his pack-sack lay with a dignity befitting their years, quite sodden and quite still. "Oh, he arted my flowers, he did," wailed old Cookie, doing a skinny dance of anger at midnight in the spring. The next morning the little old Ford and trailer, rented from Burke's livery stable, rumbled their thunder over the loose planking of the bridge at Barnhard Creek, noisily puffing and dragging the 4 Chicago fishermen and old Dan up to Hungry Hollow, together with the mountain of city fishing tackle on the trailer behind. Old Dan sat wedged in the back seat, quietly sipping his stained mustache, occasionally gingerly feeling his side, tapping the armor of Dr. George's adhesive tape around his 3 freshly cracked ribs. "How do you feel now, Dan?" asked Raymond, the driver, one of the Chicago fishermen, as they were passing Matty Hunganen's farm. Lo, Matty and Buller and Taconite were perched on the wooden entrance gate, grinning broadly. "Mornin', gentlemen," Danny said, bowing and saluting. "I said, how are you feeling?" Raymond repeated as they drove on. Dan removed his hat and massaged his bald head thoughtfully. The question deserved sober deliberation. His little gray eyes twinkled. He sat up suddenly all pert and bright. "Me? I feel like another drink." "What, before noon?" Raymond said, aghast. At the top of the long, muddy pull out of the Barnhart Valley, before the winding two-rut road began its long descent into the drainage area of the Big Dead River, worried Raymond stopped the car. He looked at his watch. It was still forenoon. "What's the use? Give him a drink, Doc," Raymond said with a little sigh. Dr. George sighed too and passed back a quart of city whiskey. "Skål," Dan said, expertly flipping up his mustache with one hand and raising the bottle with the other. He played a long solo on the bottle. "Ah!" and ran his tongue over his mustache, then quickly pulled out each end of his mustache with his free hand, rubbing the hand on his jumper sleeve. Danny was nothing if not neat. "You boys having a snort, too?" he said, conscience-stricken at last. He made as though to surrender the bottle. All of them hastily shook their heads. No. Dan, Raymond said wearily, like a teacher to a slow but lovable pupil, we came north over 400 miles to get some of those big rainbow trout you mentioned in that intriguing ad of yours. We're in training for that. Fishing before drinking, see? Sure thing, Danny agreed. Just thought you might, lads. Mind if I have a wee drop more? And it would be nice of you, Dan, being our guide and all, Carl, the big fellow, added wistfully, if you'd stay sober long enough, just long enough to kind of point out the river to us. But Danny's bald head had sagged to his chest in noisy, lip-puttering slumber as the Ford threaded its way down through the endless spruce and jack pine cuttings of Michaela the Finn. Gradually the descent became steeper. The fisherman passed the last of the cuttings, and in the distance loomed the silent, glacier-scarred mountains of the Mulligan Range, their sentinel Norway pines tall and still in the glittering May sunshine. Danny woke up for another drink as they clattered over the rushing black waters of Mulligan Creek, just above where it joined the Big Dead. In less than 5 minutes we'll be there, lads, he said quietly, going back to sleep. The little Ford snorted up the steep sand hill out of the Mulligan Valley. There was a brief glimpse of the gleaming rocky waters of the Big Dead. A mile north stretched the broad plateau before Hungry Hollow. The stumps of the once mighty white pine rising out of the sweet fern and huckleberry bushes like gravestones in an abandoned graveyard. At the beginning of the Silver Lake hardwood, the little car ground to a shuddering stop. The city dwellers had arrived at Hungry Hollow. "Moo!" Bessie called from her woodshed. "Here we are, lads," Dan said, suddenly awake, leaping nimbly from the car, taking a quick dog trot around the car to limber up his bones, including his 3 cracked ribs. Crafty Dan tried to beguile the fisherman into a card game with benefit of bottle. "You got all weekend to fish," he told them. "Way too bright right now." He squinted professionally at the sun. But with a fanatical gleam in their eyes, the zealous fishermen at once began tearing at mounds of waders and aluminum rod cases. Would their guide kindly show them the trail to the river? They were going fishing. After a quick lunch, during which the city fishermen got into their uniforms and argued whether or not to start fishing dry or wet fly, it was decided to start wet from the pool below the camp and work downriver. First, there was the endless business of dressing their tapered fly lines. Dan was able to spear 3 secret drinks during these mighty preparations. At length they were ready to leave the camp to walk down to the pool. Raymond asked Dan if he was going to fish. Flushed, Danny was sitting on the sawbuck, taking in the proceedings, industriously plucking a hair from his nose. Sure, lads, I'll fish a bit after you get started. 'Member, I'm the guide, payin' gents first." "But where's your rod, your waders and all?" Carl asked. Danny walked over to the side of the camp and took down a battered fly rod all set up, which was resting on 2 rusty nails in the logs under the eaves. Each joint was a mass of adhesive tape, like Danny's ribs, the cracked old line already threaded. On the business end was tied a scant 2 feet of frayed gut leader, all spiraled and curled like a pig's tail or a tired bed-spring. On the end of this chunk of leader was tied a sort of superfly that was faintly reminiscent of an old red feather duster, the mighty hook itself protruding from the surrounding underbrush like half of a rusty ice tongue. "Won this in a raffle during the firemen's tournament in Chippewa 17 years ago, fly and all," Dan said, proudly fondling his little pet. The Chicago fishermen looked at each other and then charitably averted their eyes. What had they gotten into? Led by old Danny, their expert guide, who fished without waders or landing net, they trudged down the trail to the big dead pool. "That's it," Dan said, elaborately pointing out the pool. "That's where you start." The guide was beginning to feel his responsibilities. A faint hint of morning mist still lingered over the pool, which churned restlessly in the shadows, hissing and boiling like some giant witch's cauldron. The four fishermen looked like a quartet of deep-sea divers as they slid and clambered down to the pool, clad in their manifold waders, jackets, bibs, landing nets, dangling scissors, gadgets, and goggles, all the while delicately holding their glistening fly rods like four fairy godfathers at a convention of wand wavers. "A hull damn sports goods store on the march," Danny muttered to himself, shaking his head. He sat on a rock above them in the warm sun, leisurely gnawing on a chew of plug, scratching his head, occasionally tenderly feeling his ribs. Raymond was the first to complete the elaborate ritual of selecting and tying a fly on his long tapered leader. He made a few false casts, feeding out line, and finally placed a graceful thistle cast into the very heart of the pool. There was a silvery flash. The line drew taut for an instant, then suddenly went limp. "Whoopee!" shouted Raymond. "Cleared out on my first cast. Whoopee!" Danny said to himself, squinting one eye. "Guess they're on the prod." He sat quietly, spitting tobacco juice at a migrating beetle, as the Chicago fishermen got under way. Two of them took fair brook trout on their first few casts, but as Dan watched them fish out of the pool and around the first bend and out of sight, no more big rainbows struck. "Too much equipment, too much hurry," he observed sorrowfully to the pool as the fishermen moved out of sight. He rose, sighted, spat, and washed out a colony of ants. Shifting his cud, he reached in his jumper and fished out a quart of purloined Chicago whiskey and played another long solo to the sun. He hid the bottle under a young spruce, then leisurely took himself and his rod down to the pool. He sat on the bank and watched the water, working his cud. He soaked the leader in the water at his feet, slowly feeding out his cracked fly line. There were no fish rising. Over his shoulder, Danny sighted the sun. It was about to disappear behind a fleecy cloud. He reached into his jumper and pulled out a slice of Swan's freshly baked bread. Breaking off a small piece, he tossed it into the pool. There was a quick silvery flash. Dan casually flipped his bedspring fly into the pool at this spot. Clap! Like an explosion, and he was on to a beauty. He dropped his rod, calmly pulled in the threshing fish hand over hand, unhooked him, and dropped him into the game bag of his jumper. Again he cast his bread upon the waters, and again, not in vain. He had 3 rainbow, all over 2 pounds, before the sun came from behind the cloud. "Guess I'll have me a little drink and meander downstream," Danny said. "Guess the big ones ain't here today. Yep. Guess I'll have me another bloody drink, maybe 2. Meanwhile, the city fishermen worked downstream, fishing with the easy precision and grace of finished experts. They'd waited all winter for this moment. The firm, graveled bottom, rarely over waist deep, made ideal wading. The air sang and whined with the whish of their long, beautiful casts. Not a single pocket or riffle did they miss. Once the short, fat one, Hank, got a boiling rise from a big one, but missed the strike. They took several more decent brook trout and quite a few youngsters, all of which they carefully returned to the water. For they were after the big rainbow, but the big rainbow were not after them. A half-mile or so below the pool they had a smoke and held a council. Hank and Big Carl decided to shore walk downstream a mile and work back, fishing dry. Raymond and Dr. George continued to work carefully down the broad river, fishing every possible place that could hide a trout, continually changing flies, now tying on a monkey-tail creation of Dr. George's, then perhaps a little polar bear number of Hank's. Finally, they rounded a broad bend where they could see the other 2 working up toward them. Still the big rainbow continued to ignore their best offerings. The 4 met again on a little gravel-bar island in midstream under the shade of a great leaning spruce which stood swaying precariously on the undercut east bank. They were all a little downcast. Carl said, "If it weren't for those 2 big rises we had, I'd say there weren't any rainbow in this damn river. Looks like we came on a wild goose chase. I suppose our guzzling old guide is safely in bed by now." "Maybe we had better fish upstream and try the pool again," Raymond ventured, remembering his first big strike. Dr. George thought old Dan might be able to show them a woods shortcut to farther downstream. If he's still sober enough to walk, that is. I wonder what the old goat is up to now. The answer came abruptly. "Halloo!" they heard, and all of them wheeled and looked upstream. Danny was rounding the far bend in the middle of the river, leaping through the water as though he had sat on a porcupine, his old fly-rod bent double before him like a graduation hoop. He was being towed, hauled, and tugged by the grandfather of all rainbows, the dorsal fin and snout of which, with its feather-duster fly, occasionally showed above water about 20 feet ahead of Dan, like a spaniel retrieving a waterfowl. Down, down came this threshing, splashing apparition toward the transfixed Chicago fishermen, standing about drugged and open-mouthed on their gravel bar. Danny, his skinny shanks working like pistons, looked as though he were tied to a runaway bloodhound. "Look out! Look out!" he shouted, but the fishermen were helpless. "I knowed it! I knowed he was in there! Look out! Here I come!" he shrilled. Dan's leader broke, spung, just as the huge fish, in the blind fury of his run, charged up onto the gravel bar, clear out of the water, and lay at the Chicago fisherman's feet, puffing like the winner of a fat man's race. "Grab him!" Danny cackled in cold horror, but the enchanted fishermen were beyond all movement. The giant fish made a mighty flop just as shouting old Danny dove through the air, making a superb flying tackle and landing on top of Grandpa. Whoosh! The two of them lay there, both very wet and both very still. It took 3 drinks from Dr. George's first aid flask to bring old Dan around. "Who hit me?" Danny said, slowly sitting up. The game bag of his jumper had come open, scattering rainbow trout everywhere. He clutched his side, the other side. "Ooh, ooh, give me another swaller of that there. I can't breathe without have another swaller." Dr. George carefully fed old Dan another drink and tenderly felt his side. He spoke softly. "I guess, Danny, I guess maybe you cracked 3 or 4 more ribs on the other side." Danny sat up on the gravel bar, blinking, gulping, looking at all the fish lying around him. But mostly he looked at his big fish, which lay glistening in the light like a big wet silver fox, stone dead. Then he looked up at the 4 Chicago fishermen. He smiled at them and slowly winked. "It kinda looks, lads, like pretty soon the old man is going to run out of ribs. Yup, yup. It kinda looks like maybe we'd ought to go back to camp and kinda celebrate like. I'll fry up the bloody fish. What do you say, lads?" The 4 wan fishermen looked at each other and nodded. Without a word, they gently gathered up Danny and his rainbow trout, including Grandpa, and slowly splashed upstream in the dappled sunlight. Old Danny, full of visions of the big time ahead, managed to sing a quavering little song. It was one of his favorite ditties. "Oh, when I'm dead and in my grave, no more whiskey will I crave. On my tombstone let this be wrote, 10,000 quarts run down his throat." The Chicago fisherman woke up the next morning, throbbing of pulse and coated of tongue, blindly groping for the water pail, but aching Danny soon had them relaxed and smiling with a round of Highland flings. The Highland fling was simplicity itself. Danny carefully explained it to the fisherman. All one needed was a tripler of Hungry Hollow moonshine, a dash of lemon juice, a little sugar, and some boiling hot water. "You dasn't put too much water," he warned, expertly flipping over a batch of buckwheat cakes on the smoky griddle. Yep, never too much water." After breakfast, he presented his guests with some of Timmy's big bucktail flies. Big flies for big fish, and lectured them for 10 minutes on the need for caution and stillness in stalking the big ones. "Easy does it, lads." Walking like an aging Junker general in his corset of adhesive tape, Danny led them down to the pool, where he initiated them into the mysteries of the trick with the bread. "Get ready now, one of you," he said, tossing out a morsel of bread. It did not fail. There was the boil, the cast, the strike, and grinning Dr. George was snug onto a tail-standing beauty. "Good luck, boys," Danny said, leaving them there, still fighting the fish. "Think I'll stick around camp and curry Bessie today. Maybe take a snooze, too." He smiled a trifle wanly. "You see, about all I got left to break is the bones in my goddamn head. Yep. The Chicago fishermen had a good day. Their creels were bulging with lovely rainbows. None of them was as big as Grandpa, of course. That night they were exultant. There just had to be another celebration. The next morning they were up and clamoring for their Highland flings, and so it went. They overstayed their leave 2 days, and when they left they proudly presented Danny with a brand-new fly rod and tapered line. They also insisted on paying double for their keep. In addition, they made glowing plans to return in November for the deer-hunting season. They were completely captivated with Hungry Hollow. "Goodbye, Danny," they called, waving from the little ford as they started away. "Take care of yourself, old man. See you in the fall." Yep, Danny said from the camp doorway, briefly saluting them with 2 bent fingers. Buller and the boys rushed into camp a few hours later to consult the audit. Muttering Danny was seated at the oilcloth table, absorbed, scratching his head, still counting out the money into neat little piles. 4 gents for 5 days at $8 a head makes, let's see, $160. Yep, it comes out exact again. Well, I'm a goddamn bow-legged tadpole. Just stayin' to home and gettin' drunk, and mine gettin' bloody well paid for it." Danny looked up. "Oh, hello, boys. Look, Buller, fetch a quart of Chicago hooch hid in one of Timmy's hip boots there hanging on the wall. We gotta celebrate. My God, we made a fortune. We're rich. We're rich." Number 10. And then the balloon went up. Chubby Miller's All-American Menagerie and Circus came to Chippewa in July. Despite its grandiose name, the circus was a modest one, consisting largely of Chubby Miller himself, several assorted Mrs. Chubby Millers, 3 despondent clowns, 2 camels, a dropsical elephant, a zebra, and 1 tired lion. There was also a patriotic trained seal that, in consideration of a sufficient quantity of herring, could be persuaded to flip around reluctantly and toot America on a series of brass horns. But by all odds, the circus's main attraction, stupendous, thrilling, death-defying, was little Eva, the Queen of the Skies, who, clad only in pink tights, would ascend in a balloon over Chippewa Thursday evening, promptly at 7 p.m., weather permitting, thence to be whisked whither the fugitive winds listeth, the Hematite Weekly and the billboards poetically announced. The advent of circuses and carnivals to Chippewa was generally greeted with dismay by the officials of the Chippewa Ore Company. They knew from long experience that a paperweight could scarcely be manufactured from the iron ore that was mined in Chippewa when a circus or carnival came to town. The miners simply wouldn't work. However, the mining officials didn't feel quite so bad over Chubby's circus because it was billed to remain for but a 1-day stand, a Thursday. Yes, they righteously concluded an occasional day off for the miners was really a good thing, especially when the Chippewa Ore Company didn't have to pay for it. Of course, Danny and the boys had to attend the circus, but Danny was firm on one point. This time they were going to try a noble experiment. They were going into Chippewa and see the circus all right, but on this trip they were going to avoid religiously all saloons and groggeries, view the circus and balloon ascension like dignified gentlemen, and return promptly to Hungry Hollow that same night, strictly sober and with money left in Danny's buckskin wallet. Yes, Thursday was far too early to commence any weekend and much too hard on the battered wallet, but they just had to see beautiful little Eva go up in the balloon. It was not that Danny and the people of Chippewa hadn't seen a balloon ascension before. They had, in fact, seen many, but all previous balloon risings had been made by hairy, grinning, cocky, muscle-bound males, curiously revolting fellows whose early and permanent disappearance skyward or elsewhere one could contemplate without a pang. Not counting the swarm of small boys, there must have been nearly 2,000 people milling around the main tent when Danny and the boys arrived in town late that afternoon. Most of them were iron miners. Being without manpower, every mine in town had sensibly shut down for the day. The bulk of the crowd was gathered around the balloon itself, which was held to the ground by ropes attached to sandbags, the huge bag itself being only partially filled with air. A couple of disconsolate circus attendants were throwing wood on the fire that made the hot air to fill the balloon. The vast bag swayed and rocked and bellied in the stiff west wind like a huge sausage tugging and straining at the sandbags which held it to the ground. Danny and Buller and the boys worked their way into the crowd until they gained the edge of the platform, upon which stood Chubby Miller and little Eva herself, complete with pink tights. Chubby Miller was a rotund, slack-bellied little man, cut from the same pattern as W.C. Fields, even to the nasal, froggy voice and minute blue veins which channeled his bulbous nose. Eva was a curvaceous blonde of indeterminate age who possessed fluttering eyelashes and the bluest, widest, most innocent eyes Danny had ever seen. He was immediately prostrated with adoration. "Ain't she purty as an angel?" he breathed in Buller's ear. Buller nodded and moistened his pursed lips. His thoughts were not precisely celestial. "She'd make a dog break his chain," Buller whispered back. Chubby was glibly exhorting the crowd. He consulted a large gold watch. "In just 1 hour, ladies and gentlemen, little Eva here will leave the earth and rise heavenward. Yes, sir, folks, clinging only to that fragile trapeze attached to the wicker basket of the balloon there, the little lady will soar amongst the clouds over your fair city, doing amazing tricks of acrobatics, even to hanging by her shapely knees." The men in the crowd studied Eva's shapely knees intently. Chubby turned to the circus touts, who were firing the balloon. "How's the balloon coming, boys? Is she filling up so's little Eva can take off before dark?" The two attendants shrugged noncommittally, and one of them threw another slab of wood on the small fire. In the meantime, a small army of concessionaires swarmed upon the milling holiday crowd, doing a land office business, selling toy balloons, bamboo canes, feather ticklers, paper reptiles that uncoiled abruptly when you blew them, not to mention bags of confetti, trick hats, and assorted false noses rivaling even Chubby's. But the most popular item was autographed photographs of little Eva, clad in an extensive state of deshabille. A real bargain at only $1/4 of a silver dollar. Danny contented himself with buying 4, evidently bent upon viewing little Eva from every point of the compass. Then there were hot dogs and hamburgers, of course, and vats full of pink lemonade, dripping ice cream cones, popcorn, and a frothy-appearing pink confection that looked more like sea foam than candy, and tasted like neither. Promptly at 7 p.m., Chubby turned to Eva. Little Eva, he declared, fixing her with a fat finger, are you ready and willing to ascend into the ether waves over the fair city of Chippewa tonight? I am, little Eva replied in a small, piping voice. And whereas, to wit, considering the hazardous nature of your enterprise, and for other valuable consideration, do you agree to waive, release, and replevin the Walter C. Miller shows, its heirs and assigns, from any and all torts and other liability in the sad event of your death or great bodily harm? Chubby legalistically demanded. I do, Eva bravely replied, tremulously fluttering her eyelashes. Then prepare yourself to go aloft, and may the Lord be with you, Chubby grimly declared. Little Eva was on her own. Chubby briskly left the platform and held a whispered consultation with the balloon attendants. He looked up at the sky and then studied the balloon. Before the watchful eyes of the crowd, he took a tent stake and judiciously poked the flabby sides of the half-filled balloon. Chubby shook his head. He returned to the platform and put his forefinger in his mouth, and then expertly held his finger up to the wind, like a Boy Scout leader confirming the imminent approach of a tornado. He again gravely shook his head and cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, Chubby announced, we have bad news for you. We greatly regret that little Eva will be unable to take off tonight, due to as how the balloon is only half full of air and won't be ready before nightfall. We've reluctantly had to cancel the great ascension. Chubby paused. There was a menacing rumble of male voices. Chubby went on anxiously. What's more, men, they's a bad wind comin' from the west, as you can plainly see, and they tell me it's only 12-15 miles east of here to Lake Superior. Chubby paused and then issued his challenge. If there's a single man in this here crowd what wants to risk our little Eva going to her watery grave tonight in the dark and icy waters of Lake Superior, let him speak up now or forever hold his peace. Eva blinked her blue eyes through tremulous, downcast lashes. To a man the crowd roared, No, no, no! Little Eva must be spared. Chubby then delivered the clincher. However, since little Eva can't take off tonight, and we realize the keen disappointment that is yours, we've decided at great expense to hold the entire show over for another day. Little Eva will take off tomorrow night prompt at 7, rain or shine, wind or calm. Chubby held up his hand to silence the approving cheer of the crowd. He lowered his voice and gave the assembled menfolk an amiable leer. And since little Eva can't take off tonight in her balloon, we've made special arrangements for her to, take off this and take off that. Chubby daintily plucked at his own clothing. In a special stag performance immediately following the main show. Yes, sir, it's for men only. The attendants will now pass among you with tickets for Eva's special midnight performance. Just think, men, for only $1 silver you can witness little Eva here personally show you things what you never saw before. And they tell me it's a-plenty. It's educational and inspirational. It's astronomical and anatomical. A high look. Who'll be the first lucky gent to help little Eva here take off?" "I'll take 5 tickets," eager Danny spoke up, nervously fingering his buckskin poke. What wonders Danny and the hundreds of other men saw at little Eva's midnight show they later spoke not of. At any rate, Danny was so transported by the exhibition that he took the boys to Charlie's for a closing round of drinks. All resolutions were overboard. Then they went over to Big Annie's to pay a social call. Danny held the center of the kitchen floor, recounting to Annie the wondrous beauty and bravery of little Eva, the queen of the skies. Big Annie listened to Danny's raptures in grave silence. When he had finished, she snorted and tossed her head and led him into the pantry and closed the door. "Listen, Danny, I hates to see an old friend of mine make a complete fool of hisself," she whispered. "Last night I promised Chubby I wouldn't tell, but I'll tell just you in strict confidence. The plain truth is your little Eva there ain't never been higher in the air than the observation platform at Niagara Falls." Annie pondered. "Let's see, was it on her 2nd or 3rd honeymoon? Yes, I guess it was her 3rd. Before she went with Chubby, she was just a leg show girl at the same carnival I used to travel with. Of course, she's considerable younger than me. She just joined up with Chubby's show last month. Queen of the Sky's my foot, hanging by her knees from a balloon. The only place that baby-faced blonde could hang by her knees from is the head of a walnut bed." Disillusioned, Danny leaned against the pantry wall as Big Annie went on. "As for that Chubby Miller there, he's just an ex-carny himself. A cheap shill what picked up this one-horse circus of his, balloon and all, in a crap game down in Florida last winter. I heard the whole story from a friend in the business. His show's nothing but a clip carnival disguised as a circus. He comes to town for one day and stays on as long as the crowd lasts. That old balloon bag of his is just a gag. A sucker's come on to draw a crowd to work on. It's never been higher off the ground than this here pantry ceiling since he won it last winter, like I told you." "But she's so purty. Little Eva, I mean, not the goddamn balloon. She's just like an angel," Danny murmured fatuously when Annie had concluded her amazing revelation. "Can't you fix it up for to introduce her to me?" "Okay, then," Annie snorted in disgust. "Have it your own way. Like the fella said, there's no fool like an old fool. But don't forget I warned you. Daniel, you'll get into a basket of trouble with that dame, sure as you're a foot high." Again, no ore was mined in Chippewa the next day. The circus was still in town. Friday was a still, windless day, and that evening an even larger throng pressed around the balloon to watch the belated ascension of Eva.